the 10 steps that you want to do for a camera prep before you start recording for any camera, any video camera. Now, some of these things, a particular camera might be so simple that you might skip one of these things, but this is basically what you would do for every camera. I also would recommend getting into the habit. Professionals will always prep their camera, at least the camera assistant will prep it. I like to show up at camera preps too, so I can tell the camera assistant what things that I would particularly like set. And so get in the habit of doing a camera prep before you shoot a project, so before you do anything. So, you know, get the camera the night before and do all that prep, because yes, you can do this on the day of the shoot, but there's always, you know, lots of stress and all that, and that's when you forget to do things. If you get your camera set up correctly, then there's not very much for you to do when you're actually ready to shoot, if you get it all set up. Okay, so obviously the first thing you would do is to build your camera on top of your tripod. Put your lens up and any accessories. So for instance, an accessory on the 5D here that we have is a rail system with iris rods and then a follow focus. That would be considered an accessory. If we end up putting an onboard monitor, I think we have Marshalls, if we put that on, then that would be an accessory. So the first thing you do is just get your camera built. One thing I didn't mention specifically, but once you build it, you probably want to always check your lens. Before you put your lens on, check the rear element and make sure there's no fingerprints or dust or smudges or anything like that. And then put that on. It's always a good idea with these cameras to keep the lens cap on when you put the lens on, and that way you don't smudge your front element. So you always want to check that. You don't want to use canned air on lenses because they have a propellant. It's better not to use lens cleaning fluid unless there's really something on there like a fingerprint or something that you can't get off. In other words, you can actually, with cleaning fluid, if you don't get it all off and dry, you can get smearing and stuff. So, you know, you don't want to use it if you don't have to. If you just have dust, then just lightly brush it off with some lens tissue paper. Some people like to use brushes, but you got to be very careful if you use a brush, because if that brush isn't kept clean, you could actually be adding dirt and things. So I have a lens cloth that I use sometimes because I forget to have lens tissue, but you got to keep that clean and keep it washed so you don't actually end up adding oil. Then you power it up. So whether you're using an AC adapter or using batteries, at that point it's a good idea, and again, this is why I say do this, you know, ahead of time and not on the morning, because it's a little late if your batteries are dead if you're charging them that morning. But anyway, if you have any batteries that are dead, go ahead and get those on charge. Then you would power your camera up. Number 4, so here's a big one. These are big ones. You want to set your, and this isn't going, all of these are not going to apply to every single camera. So just be aware of that. So for more sophisticated cameras, like the Red, you want to set the time base. Your recording frame rate is what the sensor is capturing. So that would be like 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. That's what your camera is capturing. Your time base frame rate is the rate at which your project will play back. Your time base is important because you want your camera to be set at 24 so that when you shoot at 120 frames, it will play back at 24 and therefore look like slow motion. So that's why you set your time base at 24 or 30, depending on what you want. And then you set your frame rate either the same, or if you want to go slow motion, higher. If you wanted to go fast motion, you could set it lower. You notice how I put 2398 and 2997? With digital video cameras, most of them, but not all, most of them actually, like for instance, With this camera, it says you have an option of running at 24 frames or running at 30 frames, and we'll look at that later. What it actually is it's not really 24, but it's 23.98, or more precisely, it's 23.976 or something like that. But we round it off to 23.98. And at 30 frames, when you set 30 frames, it's really 29.97. But it's good to know the precise, even if the camera's smart enough to do it. Some cameras that you have the option of recording at 24 frames or 23.98. Now, it's nice that they give you that option, but it's really kind of stupid. It's one of those gotchas. So if you ever come across that choice, I would recommend to always go with 23.98. Then we can set the record resolution. Now, most cameras on the market only record at 1920 by 1080, but cameras like the Red can go all the way up to 5K. You have options to shoot 2K and 4K, even 3K. When you shoot slow motion with some of the DSLR cameras, you unfortunately you can get 60 frames, but you lose resolution. So you have to set it at 1280 by 720 in order to get that 60 frames a second. So a lot of cameras, you just get a default and you can't change it. So it just is what it is, but I just wanted you to be aware that other cameras there is a choice. So that's why I have this in here, that you want to check and see if there's a record resolution that you can change. And the Red, that's definitely important. The record quality is usually, it's like either a codec choice or a compression ratio. And again, not all cameras, like for instance the DSLR cameras, you just have one setting. But like some of the Sony cameras and the Red camera, you can actually determine your quality. So they'll say something like 1920 by 1080 HQ or ProRes 422 HQ or whatever. You have choices in quality. And again, my recommendation is to err toward the highest quality. But the reason that's sometimes an issue, like with the Red, if you go with the highest or the smallest compression ratio, you end up losing minutes. In other words, you lose record time. So balance your needs of what's practical for your shoot versus your quality. And with the Red, the quality even at higher compression rates is really good, so you don't have to worry about that. So again, some cameras you don't have a choice, but others you do, so that's something that you always want to check in your project setting. Okay, then the next thing you do is you insert your media card and you format it. I think it's always a good idea before you start a project, while you're prepping your camera, to go ahead and format all the cards. If somebody filled that card up before you halfway, or even if you did it the day before, then what happens is when you start recording, it just adds to that card. So now if your card's half full, you now don't have, you only have half of the card before you need to change again. The next thing you want to do for your exposure settings is ISO. ISO is the sensitivity, sets the sensitivity of your sensor. So a high ISO means that it's very sensitive to light and you don't need as much light. Okay, so like if we turned most of these lights off in this room, if we increase the ISO, we'd be able to shoot in lower light. Conversely, if you're outside and it's a bright sunny day, then you don't want to have a high ISO because you may not be able to get a proper exposure. So you'd want to go down more like 100 or 160, 200. So yes, you will get excessive noise if you set your ISO too high. So rule of thumb is, don't set your ISO any higher than you need to capture a good exposure. Sometimes you have to do it if you're shooting a documentary and it's really low light. It's better to raise the ISO and get a decent exposure. There's always the possibility of reducing that noise later using a pose tool. I'll just throw out right now that if you're working with DSLRs and if you're shooting high ISO, I recommend a plugin called Neat Video. So the next thing that affects your exposure is your shutter speed. The normal shutter speed, if you want to have normal motion reproduction, is whatever your frame rate is, double your frame rate, and that is your shutter speed. So, for instance, if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, or 2398, then your normal shutter would be 1/48, 1/48th of a second. If you have a lower shutter speed, then what happens is you get more motion blur. So you can do that creatively. In other words, if someone's walking along and you photograph that, what will happen is you won't see a lot of ghosting, but you'll see a little more smear. So your motion won't appear very natural. If you increase the shutter, if you increase it just a little bit, you probably won't notice. So for instance, if you shoot at 24 frames a second and if you shot it at 1/60th of a second, you probably won't notice much difference. But if you shot it at 1/250 or 1/500, you'll notice a lot of difference. And what that is you get your motion, instead of being smooth, you get a staccato. You'll probably notice in action films a lot of times when people are running, sometimes they'll use it just to get that so sometimes it can be used creatively. So I'm not saying don't ever do it. I'm just saying if you want to do normal, then double it. That's your normal. Most of us are used to seeing 24 frames a second because that's what we're used to with cinema. That got established a long time ago as a standard rate for projection. And so when we want to do something cinematic, we typically use 24 frames a second or 1/48th of a second. One thing I do want to make clear, some cameras do not give you an option of 1/48, but they'll usually give you an option of 1/50th. So for instance, the DSLRs are that way. You don't have a choice of 1/48, so go to 1/50th. All right, the next thing is you want to set the look of your camera. What the gamma is usually expressed in a curve. Gamma is basically the dynamic range of your camera in terms of how it records and expresses highlights, midtones, and shadows. So people, Caucasian flesh tones are considered midtones, although they're a little bit higher than midtone. The right in the middle of a midtone on a normal gamma is 18% gray. Okay? So has anybody ever seen gray cards? Anybody seen people using gray cards? They're used a lot in photography and stuff. So a gray card is set at 18% gray. So if your gamma is like this, so here's sort of a normal, they often call it an S curve. It's like this. So your highlights are up here, highlights, and then your shadow. This is referred to as the knee often. In film, they refer to it as more of the shoulder. Down here, this is the shadow area. This is called the toe. So your blacks, everything, this is real black, and then it's starting to get a little lighter, and so your midtones, or your 18% gray, is right here in the middle. Okay? So now you can have all different types of gamma curves that they can stretch out this way and that way, but I just want you to, I don't want to get deep into that, but your gamma in your camera, you can change that. So you can squish this down or you can stretch it out, and so what that means is your highlights might be brighter or your highlights might be less bright. Your shadows if you have a gamma that's lifting this up, your shadows could have more light and not be as dark. So a lot of cameras will allow you to change that gamma in different ways, and you can use that based on what you want. Picture style is in camera 2. Sorry, I didn't write that in the notes. See, here's camera 1. Whoops. Camera 1 is there. Here's camera 1. There's nothing in there that we ever worry about for video. Camera 2 has the picture style. So I'm coming all the way down here to picture style. Now, landscape. Ooh, this is why you need to set up the camera yourself. You don't want that color setting for what you're shooting in. That makes things very vivid and bright and wonderful, and that's fine if you know that's what you want, but I'd rather do it later in post. So we hit it one more time. I hit the set button to go in. Now here's where I can change it. All right, so see the neutral? So we want to scroll down to neutral, and you see, so obviously here's another reason why it's very important for you to do this is you don't know who, especially at school, unless it's your own camera, you don't know who left it where, what. You've got to go in and look at these settings so that you're not stuck with what someone else thought was good, because what might be good for their project, or maybe they don't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, whatever. So you want to do it yourself. So now you see down here it says info detail set. I want to be able to select neutral, so I've selected it, and I can hit neutral, but see that takes me back. So what I want to do is now, in this particular case, hit the info button. That takes me to the next page. Okay? So if you don't remember that, just remember looking at what it says down there. Now, someone has already turned the sharpness all the way down. That's good. Now, I can't tell you why, but with these cameras, the sharpness is better to be done in post. Some people like the softness and don't ever change it because it looks maybe a little more filmic. Other people go, that just looks kind of soft and not sharp. So you can add sharpness in post. It's better to add it to taste in post, but to start with it all the way off and not have the camera do it. So that one I have turned all the way down. See, here's where the wheels, whoops, wrong wheel. See, right there in the middle, somewhere in there is the default, and so turn it all the way down. Okay. Now let's go to contrast. See, contrast is in the middle. See, now here's what annoys me. Why isn't this setting minus and plus like the others? I don't know. Just to make it harder. So take sharpness all the way down. Contrast. Whoops. Select it, Randy. Contrast, let's turn that all the way down as well. So again, that's going to get stuff more toward the middle. Select that. Saturation. Okay, saturation is down 1. Here's normal. That's normal color this is color saturation, by the way. That's normal. If you leave it there, it's not the end of the world, but again, the recommendation is to go 2 down. If you go all the way down, you're actually going to get something that looks closer to black and white. That's not good because you want to have some color information, but 2 down is just about right. Some people like that look. It's just a little less saturated, so like if you end up doing something with period or something like that, you might like to leave it there. But in post, what you do is you just go back and resaturate the color to whatever level you like. Again, the theory is that if you lower the saturation a little bit, the camera reassigns that information that would go all to color, and it puts more into luminance, which is the light value. So that's why I said you might want to shoot in monochrome if you're going to do monochrome. But if you shoot in monochrome, you're not getting any color, so you'll never get it back. So you're making that decision. If you're not sure, then shoot it in color and do it with your monitor, and then you can decide later. Okay, and then color tone, leave it in the middle. Color tone is like the hue, so whether it's going more green or magenta. So I would leave that balance alone. So anyway, that is it's not mine. It's hold on just a second. This is, if you lots of tests have been done, and this is the flattest look you can get. This is the recommended look for using these cameras. Because they don't have inherently don't have a ton of dynamic range, this will give you the most to work with in post. Okay? And I think you'll find if you're in a really contrasty situation like outdoors, you might not even change it. You might just go, wow, that looks okay, that looks good. Whereas if you had a normal setting, you'd have lots of whites blown out and your shadows would be crushed and you wouldn't like it. On an interior, you may find yourself increasing the color saturation and also increasing the contrast because it's too flat. But it's better to do that. I think the camera defaults at sRGB. That's the color space. I'm not going to get into the technical of color space. It's pretty deep. I don't even understand all of it. But just know that sRGB is what you want to record your video in. And then, I shouldn't say most people, that's not true. Still photographers are more likely to do the other. Here's the other. It's Adobe RGB. And so if you're doing all your color correction in Adobe and you're doing certain things, there's advantages to using Adobe RGB for stills, but not for video. So just make sure, just check that. So it's in the camera 2. Just while you're here, this is one of those things, just make sure that somebody didn't leave it on Adobe RGB. So on top of the camera is the white balance button. So I'm going to hit that. All right, now, here's the presets we were talking about. So you may find, I have to push it again. So you scroll through here, and so, for instance, if you can use auto white balance, if I find out any of you guys do that, I'll haunt you and kill you, okay? So auto white balance is only for, like, I don't know, documentary or what, I don't know. There might be a case, but again, professionals don't use auto functions because auto white balance is going to change based on if you just like, if you're doing a pan from here to here, your auto white balance may change and you may see it. It's not a good thing. Auto white balance is just as bad as autofocus. So don't do it. There's your daylight. As you can see, the color temperature in this room is less than daylight. In other words, this is like around 4,800. Daylight is around 56. So that's why. So this is an overcorrection. Now some people might like this look, but it's a little, yeah, it's a tan. I mean, in other words, this is a warm look. This is valid. A lot of people like a warmer look. So so that's fine. The other thing is you can do shade. So that's even. So shade is even cooler. So we're overcorrecting this more. Here's cloudy, not quite as blue as outside as shade. Now here is tungsten. What's going to happen when I go to tungsten? What's it going to look like in here?
Orange.
Orange?
I think so.
Watch what happens. It's the opposite. It's the opposite, and the reason it's the opposite is because this is higher. This is 48, and tungsten is 32. So you see, it's not adding enough red to compensate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
The greens look really dark.
Yeah, you see the greens more here. Now, if you were shooting in this room, you could choose to go fluorescent. Now, personally, I still think that looks a little cool, but the advantage of that is that supposedly it's pulling out some of that green for you. So that's a good thing. Okay, and then let's go to this other one. That has to do with the flash on camera, so that doesn't relate. I'm going to skip this one. That's their custom. I'm going to skip that for right now. Here's Kelvin. Now, watch what happens if I go to, go to Kelvin. Got to select it. Select Kelvin. Whoops. It's this one, other wheel. All right, so if I go to 48, you see how that does look a little different than the preset one? Yeah. So there's still more green in here, but it's a little warmer. You could do that. In post, though, you'd have to pull out the green. You will notice the green more on a good monitor. It's very hard to judge because we're getting this screen washed out, and so it's hard to judge contrast and color. So there's that. You can get really warm, you could take it down. So this is the one that you can use if you're outdoors. You can use this one and do it by eye till you get the color that you like. That's an option. Or you can try one of the preset ones. Okay, so that's up to you. Now, we're going to do the custom white balance next. Let me just put it in the custom. Whoops. There we go. Now, I'm going to leave this on for the time being, and I'm going to have to consult. I hate doing custom white balance on the 5Ds because it's a sort of a laborious step. And other cameras are much easier to do it with than this one, and it's not very intuitive. So I'm going to check the notes, and we'll go ahead and go through it. But I do want to show you how you do it, because where the custom white balance is most useful, I think, is when you get into a situation where the light isn't clean. And by clean light, we mean tungsten light is clean because there's no green in it. Daylight outside, there isn't an abnormal amount of green, it's balanced. But in here, there's a lot of green, and green is the ugliest thing for flesh tones. So generally speaking, you want to get rid of green. And if you do a custom white balance, it will take out the proper amount of green, because different fluorescent lighting might have more green than others. If you're under like the stadium lights, like in mercury vapors, like in high school gymnasiums and things like that, you'll get that has a lot of green. That's green and blue. So those are the kind of cases where doing a custom white balance will at least get rid of the green. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to look into your camera and find and set any exposure tools that you like. So this is important to know. Some of the most common exposure tools are zebras, histograms, and waveform. Now we'll get in. I'm not sure if we have a waveform. There's probably a waveform on the monitor. We can get into that. Waveform is one that I like to use a lot because it's one of the most accurate, and it's also it's a very standard one used in video. Waveform monitors, once you learn how to read them, give you a lot of information. Zebras are called that because what happens is it's not recorded on your video, but what you'll see in your image is you'll see areas. You get to see how terrible I draw. Here's a person here. You might see some parts of little zebras like this. They're little thin lines. And sometimes they set it up to where they go one way for one set of zebras, and then the other set of zebras goes the other way. And when you see those little lines come up, that tells you some information. And so traditionally, you will set your zebras, for most broadcast cameras, you'll set your, if you want to have a zebra that helps you with exposing people properly, then you'll set that zebra at 70%, around 70%. And then oftentimes, if you want to have a zebra that tells you what's going to be clipping, so a lot of broadcast cameras clip at around 100%. And so you'll set that at around 100%. So what happens is you will, for an average Caucasian, and there's no such thing as an average Caucasian flesh tone because looking around we have people that are darker than others. But for an average Caucasian flesh tone, if you get just a little bit of zebras on the highlights, if you set your zebras at 70%, then that tells you that's a really good exposure, an average exposure. Now sometimes you want to underexpose people or overexpose, but if you're going for a sort of normal look, if you have a little bit of zebra on a highlight, like on the cheekbone or the nose or the forehead, then that's a good exposure. 100 is helpful because you want to know what's clipping. Now sometimes some of the newer cameras actually can go all the way up to 108% without clipping. By the way, these numbers here, you'll also see the term IRE. And right now I can't remember what IRE stands for, but anyway, your video signal is measured in IRE. So traditionally 100% is clipping. When you're broadcasting, it does clip at 100%. Some cameras will let you go higher than that. So oftentimes you'll set one set of zebras at 70 and another set at 100, and they'll be different. So one will go one way and one will go the other way. That way, if there's some sky over here and I see that this is going this way, I know that this area is clipping. The viewfinder or your LCD, it's an LCD on the back of these cameras. You use an LCD for video, or you can put an onboard monitor. The viewfinder is only really helpful for shooting stills. You can't really use that for video. In fact, when you go into video mode, it shuts that off. You can't even see anything through the eyepiece. So there are certain things that you can set on your viewfinder or your LCD that are in displays. So information that tells you your f-stop sometimes, that tells you all kinds of things. We'll see those later. But sometimes you might want to change the brightness. If you're outside, you might want to increase the brightness of your LCD so you can see better. Generally, I wouldn't do it with a viewfinder, because a viewfinder, you can seal it off. And if you raise the brightness level, it might make you think that you're exposing differently. So you usually want to keep it pretty normal. Your contrast of your viewfinder. It's nice to have a good medium contrast. If you crank up your contrast too much, then it's going to affect your judgment. So you want your viewfinder set up fairly normal. Then there's also things, focusing aids. Some cameras give you focusing aids, things like false color or peaking. Oops. Wonder where that went away. Does it just do that? Okay. So we'll get more into that later. Magnification is a nice focusing tool. These cameras give you magnification. Yes?
Up to 10.
What's that?
10 times.
10 times, yeah. You get up to 10 times magnification. So that's really handy. The magnification on the DSLRs is better than any of the cameras that I've seen. So it's a really nice tool. Peaking is something nice, or edging. I can't really demonstrate that on this camera. We might be able to get some, there's sort of a simulated peaking in the red we can look at. So those are all things that are, again, you could shoot without those. It doesn't affect the image, but it affects how you do your job. Makes it, anything that makes it easier to get accurate focus obviously is important. So you'll set those things up, and then I always like to say number 9 is important. That's one of those, before you shoot, you want to just look at all your display, and you want to just make sure that everything looks right and you've got it set where you want it before you shoot. And then of course the last one is pretty obvious. You get your, really 1 through 8 can all be done the night before, ideally. And then 9, that day you check it, you fire it up, you double check your settings, and then 10, you're framing your shot and you're focusing, and then also you're doing your final exposure with your camera, and that's with your iris on your camera, or you do your iris with the in camera with the Canon 5D. And then you hit record and you're going. All right? So any questions on that? That's sort of an overview of any camera.